Welcome to the Research for Social Change Lab podcast. For our first series, we will be presenting panel talks and conversations from the Symposium on Housing and Homelessness in Peterborough. The first panel of the Symposium on Housing and Homelessness addresses one of the overarching causes of housing scarcity, the financialization of housing. State-driven efforts to tackle the problem of homelessness rarely, if ever, work to address the structural causes of the problem and instead aim to implement market-based solutions. This panel, consisting of speakers Tammy Kuhn from One City Peterborough, Rebecca Morgan-Quinn from the City of Peterborough, and Annie Hedden from the Community Counseling and Resource Center, looks at alternatives to the for-profit housing market. The panel begins with a presentation from Annie Hedden on how the financialization of housing affects the private market, posing challenges for affordability, accessibility, and the adequacy of available housing. The next presentation, from Rebecca Morgan-Quinn, looks at what affordable housing is, what it looks like, and ways of sheltering housing units from being swept into the private market. The final presentation, from Tammy Kuhn, explores why, how, and what works regarding one city's efforts to purchase congregate housing. Each presentation points to a hopeful alternative to the status quo of private housing and rental units, highlighting the power of community organizations to support those facing precarious living situations by bypassing the for-profit housing market.
Welcome to the Financialization of Housing and Local Stock panel, one of two panels happening right now, and I'm really happy that you chose this one because I think it's going to be a really good one. Everything at this event is so good that we had to record the session so that if you missed one, you could listen to it later. We're really lucky today to have Tammy Kuhn from One City Peterborough, Rebecca Morgan-Quinn from the City of Peterborough, and Annie Hedden from the CCRC, the
Community Counseling and Resource Center.
Thank you. And I'm going to kick us off by just sort of setting the scene a little bit in terms of the financialization of housing in Ontario and in Canada. And I'm just realizing now that when I kicked off the conference this morning, I didn't say who I am. So I'm Naomi, and I am a professor of sociology here at Trent University and the director of the Research for Social Change Lab, which is one of the partnering organizations for this event. And I am really happy that you're all here. So Peterborough has an important goal. We have the goal of ending chronic homelessness in our community by 2025. But to reach this goal, we need to increase access to affordable housing in general, and then specific types of affordable housing that meet residents' health, social, and/or developmental or physical needs. Before we dive into this conversation with our three local experts about what housing stock we do have, what we need, and how we should work together to close the gap between what we have and what we need, I want to provide a little bit of background. Set something straight. Researchers consistently suggest that attending to the structural and systemic drivers of homelessness, such as poverty and a lack of affordable housing, is integral to undertaking homelessness prevention. More than a decade ago, a scholar in the United States, Dennis Culhane, argued that the homeless serving sector has evolved into an efficient shadow sector, replicating mainstream social services for those for whom the mainstream has failed. Updated typologies of homelessness prevention continue to point toward the importance of universal population-based actions, those things that help us all, as well as targeted upstream interventions for specific at-risk groups, supports for people who are about to lose their housing, emergency supports for those who have lost their housing, and then specific targeted interventions for people who have lost their housing a bunch of times. However, in practice, state-driven prevention efforts rarely include that first, most important part, the structural interventions, and homelessness prevention work is usually separated from the work of poverty reduction and housing market interventions. So this is certainly what's happening in Ontario. Right now in Ontario, we have a poverty reduction strategy that no longer refers to ending homelessness. Further, under the previous Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative, homelessness prevention activities are narrowly described as emergency financial assistance for unpaid rent or utilities, landlord outreach, and mediation. So always after a person has lost their housing or is right about to lose it. The new homelessness prevention program announced in 2022, which sets out funding criteria and directs eligible expenses for municipal service managers, includes no measures that would be considered structural prevention efforts. So again, poverty reduction and an increased investment in affordable housing. Or homelessness prevention legislation, such as the duty to assist, which exists in other parts of the world. At the federal level, portable rent supplements have become the dominant form of a state-led homelessness response. So currently the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario jointly fund the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, which is meant to close the gap between household income and the cost of housing. While this kind of financial support does help individuals in the short term, it does not attend to the structural drivers, such as the financialization of housing or the stagnation of household incomes, that perpetuate housing instability. In fact, the rent subsidies actually function as a direct transfer from government to private landlords. This is particularly problematic given recent research that suggests that entrenched housing inequality in Canada is primarily the result of financialization. This is a 2023 study, so it's actually like the most current, and they modeled all the potential causes of the housing crisis in Canada, and it is fundamentally housing financialization and moved by our federal government in the 1990s. Several state-initiated moves are implicated in this problem that we now see, such as the increasing normalization of neoliberal ideas about the importance of investments in property as an investment in financial well-being for individuals for the lifetime. Like, I grew up learning this message. And then also transforming our state institutions like the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation to advance home ownership as its central role and real estate investment by ensuring the debt that we're all in as homeowners. Growing housing disparity creates a context in which the need for those individualized housing benefits to support access to this private market are going to continue. The need for those benefits will only grow over the long term. And landlord-tenant relationships in this financialized model remain constant. They don't change. These approaches fail to look outside of the current market as a solution to homelessness and thus fall short of advancing people's positive rights to housing. In contrast, today, we're going to look at the state of housing and rental market in Peterborough, examine innovative practices for housing decommodification, and look at where we sit in terms of our local investments in affordable housing. So today we are not situating the sort of full scope of our imaginations within the housing market as it is currently operating in Canada. And are you going in this order? No? Who's going first?
I'm Annie Hedden. I'm going to talk, we're going to start off today by talking about private market rental housing, sort of set the stage for the impact that financialization is having on the private market, and then you'll hear from Rebecca and Tammy, who will talk about social housing and those innovative strategies that Naomi was talking about. So, like I said, I'm Annie Hedden. I work at the Housing Resource Center, which is at CCRC, which is Community Counseling and Resource Center. We do a ton of work with tenants, most of whom are struggling in some way with their housing. So when I'm talking about the private market, I'm not necessarily talking about an entirely representative sample of the whole market, primarily folks who have low income and who are struggling with barriers to finding or keeping housing. So in a super tiny nutshell, I would essentialize the work that we do by saying that we help people to find housing, to keep housing, and to understand what their rights are as tenants. And to pursue their rights as tenants, but for the purpose of this presentation, to understand the rights as tenants. So some of the challenges that we see in the private market when we're helping people to find housing revolve around affordability, availability, adequacy, and discrimination. Not necessarily in that order, so let's take a look. Looks like a lot of words when you pull it up on the big screen. Okay. Availability is probably the first barrier that people come across when they start to search for housing in the private market. They'll pull up Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace, and the first thing that they'll notice is that there's not a lot out there. In Peterborough, the vacancy rate right now is sitting at around 1%. I think it was 1.1% the last time I saw a statistic. I think it was from last year though. I think a healthy vacancy rate is usually around 4%, I think. Right now it's 1%. So the vacancy rate's super low. That means there's not a lot out there. Part of the reason for that is that there is a high demand for rental units right now. There are a ton of factors contributing to that. Some of them are really, really positive things for our community. So we have students looking for housing. We have immigration. So a lot of really cool folks coming from other countries bringing skills and abilities and ideas and diversity to our communities. We have, apparently across Canada, some high youth employment right now. So we have youth looking for housing, competing for rooms in one-bedroom apartments with other folks with lower incomes who are also competing for those same units. We have seniors now who are increasingly able to age in place because there are supports and services and they have the resources to do so. So there are positive things that contribute to demand and competition for housing. We also have young folks and young families who are not as able right now because of affordability to move along the housing continuum into home ownership. So there are some less positive reasons why there is demand for rental housing. We also see some loss of rental housing due to poor conditions. And in communities like Peterborough, where we have rural locations, we have cottagers, we have a lot of vacationing, we do see some loss of units to short-term rentals and Airbnb type situations. I don't think we haven't seen that being a huge problem in Peterborough, but it is something to consider. We also see some flight from urban areas like Toronto, so folks coming in from Toronto, moving to Peterborough and accessing housing here. So those are just some of the pressures on our local rental market. Adequacy is another issue that people face when they're searching for housing. It's definitely a problem in Peterborough where we have a lot of older housing stock. We also have few physically accessible units. A lot of the accessible units that we consider accessible and also that tend to be available to the folks that we serve at the Housing Resource Center are in apartment buildings. If you've ever lived in an apartment building or looked for a place in an apartment building in Peterborough, then you've probably heard that they're notoriously infested, struggling with pest issues. So that does raise some adequacy concerns. People tend to, because of the vacancy rate and the availability issues, tend to have to take whatever happens to be available at the time when they're searching. So if people have specific needs around what neighborhood they need to live in, if they have to be close to a doctor's office or a specific social service, they often aren't able to meet those needs when they're moving. There's not a lot of choice in housing right now. Adequacy is one of the basic tenets of the right to housing. But it's not something that people are often able to meet, especially folks who have been evicted, who have had a previous experience of homelessness or housing precarity. Research has shown that when people are evicted, they tend to move into new housing that is both less affordable and less adequate to meet their needs. And then discrimination in housing searching is a huge issue right now. We see a lot of discrimination based on race and ethnicity, also on sex and gender, especially against men. So the housing market right now shows a huge bias in landlords towards women. Landlords definitely want to rent predominantly to women. Housing history, so landlords do not want to rent to anyone who's had a previous eviction. They don't want to rent to anyone who's currently unhoused or has a history of homelessness. Anyone who might present as having mental health challenges or currently struggling with their mental health. And really, there's no accountability mechanisms to hold landlords to account for any type of discrimination during the housing search process. I mean, there are, but they're not anything that reasonably or realistically anybody's going to follow up on. And then the application processes to rent a unit in the private market all rely pretty much entirely on having access to technology. Where 5 or 10 years ago, you would be able to have a phone number where you could phone a landlord. I would say 75% of landlords now need you to email them or have a Kijiji or Facebook account in order to connect with a landlord. And then also have access to a computer and the skills and knowledge to type and reply to the landlord electronically, which is a huge barrier for a lot of folks. But affordability still is the primary barrier when searching for housing. And that unaffordability is driven primarily by financialization. Average market rents across Peterborough, across Canada, I would say, are increasing faster than people's incomes. And then rents are increasing for a number of reasons. Rents just simply are allowed to increase under the Residential Tenancies Act by a little bit every year. For 2024, it's 2.5%. Your rent's allowed to go up by 2.5% every year, or this year, sorry. There are also illegal rent increases that happen, and sometimes those are just mutually agreed upon by landlords and tenants. Sometimes they happen because tenants don't understand what their rights are. Sometimes they happen because landlords don't understand what the rules are. They just happen and people live with them. Above guideline rent increases are increasingly becoming a problem. The cost of being a landlord is increasing right now. So a lot of landlords are applying to the Landlord and Tenant Board to increase rents above the allowable limits to help them cover the costs that they need to pay to maintain their units. Interest rates are increasing, which is sort of the driving factor behind the increased costs of home ownership for landlords, which is pushing the rents up also. But these two bottom points, I think, are the major drivers of increased rents. So REITs are real estate investment trusts. They're huge corporations. Often they're multinational corporations that own tons and tons and tons of rental units. They own apartment buildings. Sometimes they own entire neighborhoods full of housing. Not so much in Peterborough, but definitely they own apartment buildings in Peterborough. Absolutely they do. And the reason they own housing is not because they want to be a housing provider. It's because they see the apartment buildings as a way to make profit. And their number one ethical responsibility is to make as much profit as they can for their shareholders. And they have to do that not just right now, this year, but they have to do that in an ever-increasing way year over year. So they have to raise the rent as much as they possibly can every single year. So they have to renovate units as much as they can so that they can apply for above guideline and rent increases as much as they possibly can. They have to ensure that there's as much turnover in units as much as they possibly can so that they can raise the rent between tenants, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Because the way that they do that is through the next point, which is vacancy decontrol. So let's talk about vacancy decontrol. In Ontario, we sort of have a policy of rent control, sort of. Because during a tenancy, while a unit is occupied, there are limits to when and by how much a landlord can raise the rent, right? Like I said, they can raise the rent this year 2.5%, and they can do that one time. But as soon as the unit is vacant, as soon as their tenancy is over, they can raise the rent as much as they want to. And that's called vacancy decontrol, right? So whenever the unit is vacant, they can set the rent as high as they want. And what we're seeing is the landlords are doubling the rent after a tenant moves out. So what this means in practice is that this is actually an incentive for the landlord to evict a good tenant. So what we're seeing is tenants who have lived in the same unit for years or even decades being evicted at no fault. They've done nothing wrong. They've been a good tenant for a decade, and they're being evicted for basically no reason, because the landlord wants a new tenant in there so they can double the rent. And landlords are coming up with all kinds of creative, new, inventive ways to get good tenants out of units. So here are some of the challenges that we're seeing at the Housing Resource Center when we're helping tenants to keep their housing in this brand new landscape of creative evictions. We're seeing bad faith evictions, illegal evictions, cash for keys deals, and then our good old-fashioned evictions for rent arrears. So here are some of the details. So we are seeing evictions for tenant factors, right? We're always going to see those. There's always going to be tenants who fall behind on their rent, tenants who are evicted because of damages or behaviors. We provide a lot of support to tenants around these evictions. Tenants, the important thing to remember is that tenants are always entitled to legal process, right? Tenants never have to leave their unit simply because they receive an eviction notice from a landlord. We're seeing a lot of tenants, and we kind of always have seen a lot of tenants who leave their unit because they agree to, right? And this can happen, it's usually informal. The landlord just tells the tenant, you need to be out on this date. And the tenant's like, okay. And the tenant knows it's going to cause them great hardship. They don't want to leave. But for whatever reason, they don't either know their rights or they choose not to pursue their rights. Usually, I think this is because of the power dynamic between the landlord and the tenant, and because of how incredibly time-consuming and difficult it is for tenants to actually pursue their rights. Going through the landlord and tenant board is not an easy or accessible process for a tenant, even though we're there to support them every step of the way through that process. The end result is living in a unit where you're in a conflicted relationship with a tenant, right? I mean, your landlord. So tenants often just leave as soon as the landlord asks them to, or within the time frame the landlord asks them to. We're also seeing cash for keys deals, which are interesting, which is basically where a landlord offers a tenant a lump sum of money in exchange for them leaving the unit at a specific time. So we'll see some landlords that offer sort of a lowball deal to the tenant. I'll give you $3,000 if you leave in 2 months. We're seeing higher deals where tenants will get maybe $10,000 to leave. It's never enough. You cannot find housing in 2 or 3 months, which is the time frame landlords are giving. $10,000 isn't enough to make up for the difference a tenant will pay in rent over the course of a year. It's more than enough to make up for the difference in rent that a landlord will receive over the course of a year. So the financial disparity between the landlord and a tenant isn't equitable in those cases. But it's a lot of money for a tenant, so it feels like a very persuasive offer. It feels fair to the tenant in the moment, but in the long term, it doesn't work out in the tenant's favor. And the reason why landlords are asking tenants to leave in these situations is because of the vacancy decontrol. It's because as soon as the tenant's out of the unit, the landlord can increase the rent drastically. We're also seeing a pretty big increase in landlords asking tenants to leave so they can sell the house. This is mostly from smaller landlords who maybe own 1 or 2 houses that they're renting out. Selling, and I mean, I feel like this is probably because of the rising interest rates and landlords can't afford to keep the home anymore. So you can feel some empathy for the landlords in these situations, but that doesn't make it legal. Legally, the landlord cannot ask the tenant to leave simply because they're selling, unless the new owner plans to move in, and then there's a legal process for that. But we're seeing a lot of those requests happening. But by far the most common reason that we are seeing right now is landlords asking tenants to leave because they plan to move into the unit. Often we and the tenants feel that these eviction notices are being issued in bad faith. We don't think the landlords are planning to move in, or a member of the landlord's family is planning to move in. We think these are to take advantage of the vacancy decontrol again. We've seen instances where the same landlord has issued an N12, it's called an N12 notice, has issued a notice to 2 different tenants, like the landlord's gonna live in both units. There have been instances where we know the landlord has a spouse and kids and 2 dogs and lives in a large house in Mississauga, but has issued an N12 notice to a single bedroom basement apartment downtown Peterborough, and it just doesn't feel like that's a realistic situation. So we're seeing a ton of those. I couldn't find a statistic for how many have been issued in Peterborough, but I found a statistic, and it's kind of a silly one, but the same number of N12 notices were downloaded from the Landlord and Tenant Board website in Toronto as N4 notices. And N4 notices are notices for rent arrears, which is like mind-blowing, because that many landlords are planning to like leave their current residence and move into their rental housing. Like, it just doesn't make sense. But own use eviction notices are out of control. So eviction, and it's past the point of a crisis. We're seeing so many tenants being asked to leave their units for so many different reasons. And I expect that we're going to start seeing people being asked for all kinds of other reasons that we're just sort of trying to wrap our heads around now. So this is my final slide. Tenants' rights and access to justice is something that we've always tried to wrap our heads around at HRC. Given the number of bad faith eviction notices we've been dealing with over the past couple of years. It's an area that we're trying to move into more. We have been thinking a lot about the right to housing and how we can help regular, everyday people realize that right and advance that right in their real lives. So we've been doing a lot of work around helping people access the landlord and tenant board, how we can help tenants to bring applications forward to the landlord and tenant board, how we can help them navigate those processes because they're entirely digital. There's no in-person hearings with the landlord and tenant board, and how we can help tenants bring applications forward when they're dealing with these private market issues, and deal with some of these challenges to help tenants access the housing justice that they're entitled to.
Just in case that thing happens where there's no time left for Tammy or whatever. We'll see that. So thank you so much, Annie. That was amazing. My mind is buzzing. And it's like,
hi everybody, my name is Rebecca Morgan Quinn. I'm the Director of Social Services with the City of Peterborough, but before that I was the Manager of Housing for many years, so I have a fairly good understanding of the housing portfolio, and working closely with the Housing Resource Center, of course, we understand what the housing market looks like in general. But what I'm primarily going to talk about today is kind of the areas where we, through funding, through various programs, are kind of sheltering units from the market so that we can provide rents at a level that tenants can afford, and we can support people to be stably housed. So these are my basic topics. I know what is affordable housing sounds really like basic, but it's a question that I get a lot, and I wanted to break it down a little bit. I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the general areas, types of housing we have, the gaps and pressures in our system, and I want to leave you with some bright spots because it can wear you down. So when we talk about affordable housing, there are sort of two primary ways that we measure affordability, or that we talk about affordability. One would be based on the market. So this is when you see affordable housing advertised, and then you look and it says it's 80% of average market rent. So that means that it's based on the calculation of average market rent by CMHC, and then 80% of that, and that pins it to the market. So it means that as the market increases, so do those 80% of average market rent rates. And we know that incomes, especially for people on social assistance, are not increasing to match. If you're on Ontario Works, not increasing at all. That market-based affordable, we're kind of saddled with the word affordable, which feels like it's been kind of evacuated of meaning because it was the term that the province gave the program that has helped us develop affordable housing in our community. But when the feds and the province are talking about affordable housing, they're often referring to what I like to say is below market housing. So it's not necessarily affordable to you because the program isn't person focused in that way. It's focused on the market. Whereas income-based affordability, what most people think of as rent geared to income, looks at what is 30% of your monthly income, and your rent shouldn't be more than that. And there are types of rent geared to income that we have in rental, but Habitat for Humanity is another example where they take that model and they put it into home ownership. So 30% of your monthly income is considered affordable, which would leave you with enough of your income to, one would hope, cover other costs, although we know costs are increasing across the board. And so yes, it does tie it to income levels. So if you are on Ontario Works and you're in rent geared to income, you're actually paying a very low flat rate, so that you're not paying more of your income towards your rent than you can afford. And so just trying to break it down and talk a little bit about when Naomi mentioned about portable housing benefits. So that top tier of rents, market rents and above, in general, as the city, I don't have very much to do with the developments that have happened. Any of the new apartments that are going up, that big announcement, chances are, unless it's an affordable project, we haven't had, other than like planning, but from social services, we're not that engaged. Where we do engage is at that, and I say AMR to 80%, average market rent to 80%, because some of our earlier programs only required 100% of average market rent. But in general, because we're doing these programs through the federal and provincial government funding, we're looking at 80% of average market rent. But we know that that doesn't get us all the way down to that bottom tier of 30% of monthly income. So this is where, so the market understanding of the market-based affordability meets the income-based affordability, and the bridge for those two things is the portable housing benefit. And I totally hear what Naomi is saying, that a portable housing benefit kind of just out free in the system doesn't necessarily get us closer to affordability, because in the general market, those rents are just going to keep going up and tenants' incomes are not, and so they're going to need a higher and higher benefit. Where it is really effective is when we stack it. So we have units that are at 80%, and then we can offer a portable housing benefit. We can actually create, we don't call it RGI anymore because that was like a very specific program, but it is small r, small g, small I, rent geared to income. And so that's what we're really looking at trying to do as we go forward. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but there are significant costs associated with trying to provide that affordability. And I guess that's where I want us to all understand, what does it actually take? Like, if we're asking, we need more, we need to understand, like, what does it take to get us there? So the below market, the 80% of average market rent, and I know this is a shocking number, but it's about $450,000 per unit. That would be all the costs in to provide rents at 80%. One of the other big costs that we're seeing, along with interest rates, is insurance. I really don't want to talk about insurance. It's a huge pressure for our community housing providers, as well as other providers that are just trying to do the right thing and offer rents that they think are better meeting the needs of people in our community. And then to reach that 30% of income, we apply the portable housing benefits, and those, of course, have a budget associated. So we have to look at, for each one of those, it's between $5,000 to $8,000 a year. 100% money well spent, but we have to be budgeting it, right? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the bright spots we've had with these portable housing benefits, because Peterborough is really rocking getting the money out of the province for these benefits. So it's pretty exciting. So as I said, these are projects where there's not an intervention, but you might have seen in the paper, affordable housing program units. The one on the right here was advertised in the paper as being affordable housing. It did get CMHC dollars, but not in the form of capital. It was just financing. So it was still funding under the National Housing Strategy, so they're using that affordable term, further removing meaning from it. But those are technically market rents. So it's a challenge that we face, is even understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about affordable housing. Below market housing, which trying to get away from using that affordable word, these are the 80% units. Actually, I think one of them's right across the street on the bottom left corner. That's Bradburn House. These received financial support from the city, but also from the feds and the province upfront to make them more affordable. And then in many cases, the top is the Hunt Terraces, the new Bonaccord building that Peterborough Housing has done. In many cases, we have applied a housing benefit to bring those rents down from that 80% to 30% of income. And rent geared to income housing is like our bread and butter as the housing as housing services within social services. These are we have a required number of rental units that we have to maintain. So 1,569 units of rental housing that provides rent geared to income we have to provide in our community, and we do it in lots of different ways. I have Ontario Aboriginal Housing here. That's their building, but most of their actual RGI units are in scattered houses. You probably wouldn't know. You'd walk by and you wouldn't necessarily know, but they're a really big partner in providing housing for people who are Indigenous Métis. Rent geared to income housing is like a goal. It's an amazing resource in our community, but we know it's not enough. So we have we have 1,569 that we're required to have. There are more units within that are actually charging below market rents. This is a shelter from the rest of the market for people. So they only pay 30% of their income, and there's no time limit on it. And often there are other social programs that can be connected to them, so they might find it as an entry point into other connections. Peterborough Housing Corporation has housing support workers. Some of the other organizations like Kairos really support women who are fleeing domestic violence. Of course, the YWCA has similar support services. So this is an incredibly valuable resource. We're coming to a very pivotal point with this resource where I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but basically it's like they've all almost paid off their mortgages, and well, they have, and depending on whether they want to continue as they have been, we could see a loss of rent geared to income housing in our community. They would still be nonprofits. They would still be required to meet their mandate as nonprofits, but would they still be able to provide rent geared to income? So we're in the process of negotiating with all of these providers, but also understanding what is it going to cost to maintain this housing for the long term. These are people's homes, obviously, and we need to maintain these homes for the people who are in them, but also to provide the opportunities going forward. One of the pressures in rent geared to income housing, people always say the waiting list is so long, and yes, it is. It's long because we don't have more units to provide, but it's also long because this is a sheltered space, and it's very hard now, especially more than ever, to transition out of it, because unless you've had a serious increase in your income, the gap between what you're paying in rent geared to income versus the market, it's just not doable. So in a more healthy environment, I would say that the lack of turnover in our unit says something good about our communities, but I think more now it's about people don't have another option. They can't move out because they will never find something as affordable, but they'll also never find a single mom with 3 kids will never find a 4-bedroom townhouse in her price range, whereas in rent geared to income housing, that is something that's available. So we'll talk a little bit about system gaps, and of course the number of Affordable, rank year to income, and portable housing benefits. These numbers are a little bit out of date, but we know we have around 3,000 if you count everything. But we know too that our targets on top of that, it's almost we're almost targeting to double that, because we know we need that much more. We know that 3,730 households in the city of Peterborough need some form of affordable housing. The other resource gap is support services. And when we talk about housing for people experiencing homelessness, I think one of the points that was made this morning about culture shock, about the time that it takes to be housed and feel safe and secure in your housing, that's not a small thing. And anyone who's experienced homelessness, we need to be providing some measure of support to, if it's just enabling that transition or potentially providing them support over the long term. We know people who've experienced homelessness have much higher rates of mental health, physical health, and addictions. These are all things that don't go away when you get housed, but you have a much better basis to work on them. And people need that time to be ready to do that. So we know that we've created housing supports with some of our new projects, but it's not enough. And the biggest barrier for people staying housed is that they don't have the supports to do so. Some bright spots. One of the biggest bright spots, I would say, in the last little while, and it is not, I want to be really clear here, it's not an answer, it's not a solution, but it is a really important part of what we've done so far, is the 50 units of modular bridge housing at Wolf Street. Standing up that project in 6 months was pretty phenomenal, amazing team. Jocelyn's trying not to make eye contact. And it's not, and I want to be clear that it's not the answer. I think a lot of people want to frame homelessness as a problem and this is a solution. This is a place for people to heal. It's a place for people to recover from very difficult circumstances. But what it is doing is saying there's a need in this community for something like this. This was the quickest way we could get there, but we need to create more permanent solutions. Another big bright spot for me, and I think for the community, is 681 Monaghan Road getting funded. Yay! So it's an amazing story, but it's also a story about how much it'll take. So $19 million for 53 units is not small, but it means we have a building that stands on its own. It doesn't go into its next steps with a huge crippling debt. It means that we can be innovative with those units, and those units we have to dedicate. We are wanting to dedicate to people experiencing homelessness, people, Indigenous people, Black Canadians, families that are fleeing domestic violence, and then we have some, sort of not specifically designated units. These are two bright spots that you can see. A couple other bright spots that I think are worth mentioning is that the city is working towards a plan to redevelop Peterborough Housing's properties, which would add a huge number of new units to our system. To do that, this is where, it's not just, we didn't just say it. We hired someone to help us do that, which is huge, right? We have a project manager who's focused on that work. They were incredibly helpful, and are incredibly helpful with both the Wolf Street and the Monaghan Road projects. The city has said it's important, and we were making a permanent staff person to take these pieces forward. So, so that's a huge step from my perspective. Another bright spot is the portable housing benefits. I have an amazing manager of housing who has been like a dog with a bone getting more. So it's a weird program, but basically if we can get as many portable housing benefits out the door and go back to the province and say, we can take more, we can take more. He got over double what our original allocation was. So we're putting that money into the community, and we're trying to be as thoughtful as we can. We're working with people who are, getting the Canada Ontario Housing Benefit, or working with one of our client service workers. So we're really trying to make sure that they're making a positive move. And wherever we can, like Monaghan Road as an example, we're trying to layer it into our buildings so that, yes, that person could take that portable housing benefit away, but for the time being, we know we have this building is allocated to provide those rents that are going to hit that 30% rate. And that's it for me.
Thank you. We have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to try and be fairly quick and touch on the important points, and then hopefully we have a bit of time for conversation. My name's Tammy. I am the Director of Support Services at One City Peterborough, and I think a healthy combination of rage about the parts of our system that don't work and maybe some hope, and I think that's usually the mix that means we end up in the programs that we end up in at One City. And congregate supportive housing is one of those programs. So we used to run many moons ago a low barrier shelter called the Warming Room, and it was coming up to springtime. It was only a winter program. We had lots of folks staying with us that were going to be living rough, going back into tenting or prisons or hospital spaces when we closed. And trying to figure out what we do with that, we decided to find a house and house some folks. And we had no clue what we were doing. We were just like 4 people crammed into Christian's office. And now we've purchased several houses, and housing is really a core priority for the work we do at One City. I liked your agenda, so I had to find some there. So the program I'm going to focus on today is our purchasing of congregate housing stock. So I want us to be on the same page that it matters, which I think we've gotten there. Convince you that it works. I'll share the pieces that I'm really proud of around our program. Convince you that you can join in. So when I hear the numbers and the quantity and the volume that is required around social housing, it can feel really overwhelming and daunting when we are not the city and don't have resources at large. And so this program gives me hope that there are spaces where nonprofits that are smaller can join in on this work. And then gaps and next steps so that we can remain grounded and figure out how to move forward together. So why are we buying housing? Some of the congregate housing that we house folks coming out of homelessness in, we don't own. We partner with private landlords and we manage those spaces. But like it's been very clearly stated, the for-profit market has a duty to make money. And so even though we all believe that housing is a right and a basic need, that's not what it looks like in practice. Nonprofits have a duty to the people we serve. And so what gets me excited about the creativity that goes into this work is that we can think about reclaiming those spaces, protecting stock from the private market, and start to build this alternative economy that makes housing a basic need again. So to tell you a bit about the program that we run at One City, we own 5 houses around the city. That's a total of 23 rooms. And then we partner with private landlords to manage another 7 houses. So that's a total of 46 rooms that we have. Our partnership work is wonderful. Often the homeowners that we partner with are also invested in the work and are excited about their homes being used for this. It also means we don't have control over when they decide to sell those houses or what kind of rent increases are happening. And so we've really found that purchasing the stock is what gives us and our residents the stability that we need. And then on top of that, we also have another division in there. So One City manages all the housing, both the housing that we own and the one that we partner with. And that means that we act as a landlord for all those spaces. We have a great agent of the landlord team that does things like leases and contracting and liaising with homeowners and thinking about pest control and all of those landlordy pieces. In 6 of the houses, our One City supportive housing team provides the support to the folks living in them. And then in 6 of the houses, we partner with other nonprofits in the area, so Forecast, EFRI, No Go Friendship Center, and Senior Women Living Together, so that we're doing the management pieces, but they're providing the supports in those houses. That's been really great because there are ways that they can support people that we cannot as One City. And so it feels good to be able to share our management resources and then provide space for other nonprofits to do the support work. Okay, so what works about buying up, what we found about buying up congregate housing? Because we're not buying congregate housing because we think it's better than self-contained units, even though for some people it is. But self-contained units are expensive, and congregate housing is readily available and comparatively affordable. So every time we buy a house, we're able to house, our houses range from 3 to 7 bedrooms. So we can more quickly move people out of homelessness into housing. Often the people that sell us homes are also partners in this. So we have people coming to us with a house that they're wanting to sell, saying, we will sell it to you below market because we care about the work that you're doing. It removes housing from the private market, right? So we've already spoken about the importance of doing that, but it also keeps housing that is currently affordable or part of the nonprofit world from re-entering the private market. So one of our most recent purchases were a duplex that was owned by Peterborough Housing Corporation, and they were selling that in order to make money for some of these new builds that are happening, right? And so thankfully we were able to fundraise enough money to purchase those houses and keep them in the affordable realm instead of them returning to the private market. It reinvests housing dollars back into the nonprofit sector. So our residents are paying rent. In some of our partnerships, we're receiving rental subsidies. If that was private housing, that would go to a private homeowner. When it comes to One City, we use it to keep our housing in good shape, do maintenance, do repairs, and then if there are surplus, to use that towards the housing supports that are harder to fund. And our residents also tell us it gives them a sense of stability. So they know that we are running the housing because we want them to be housed, and they're not worrying about the house being sold next year, and that allows people to settle into that housing and stabilize more quickly. So around the supports that we offer, what we found works is that residents can transition to permanent housing in place. So often our congregate housing models for supportive housing are transitional occupancies only. So that means you can stay for usually up to 4 years, and then you'd have to move out of that. We know, because we've tried this, that there isn't housing to move into. And so what we've evolved to doing is that people do start on occupancy agreements, and that gives housemates a chance to make sure this is a good fit, that the culture is working, make sure that things are going okay with us as the house owner, and then people get signed onto a residential tenancies lease, which protects them from being evicted much more than an occupancy agreement does. Residents are deeply engaged in the matching process. So if you have roommates or housemates or partners or kids, you know that it's hard to live with people, especially people you haven't picked. And so because of that, the feedback that our residents give us is that it really matters that they're involved in all pieces of that matching process. So residents tell us about the expectations they want in their home, the culture that they're hoping to create. They meet any potential new housemates. We facilitate conversations around what everyone is looking for. And that really is one of our best eviction prevention practices, because it allows us to create communities, not just rooming houses where people are coexisting, but where there is a sense of hopefully at least trust and sometimes real friendship and support between the people living in those homes. And each house, because they're separate and around the city, has its own culture expectations. ways that they work. So we have our biggest house is a low barrier space where people can use substances, where people struggle with physical health or mental health. And chaos is part of that world. And then we have houses where the people living there have set rules for each other that I would not succeed in, because that's what they're wanting, right? And so it really allows autonomy for the people in each of those communities to create, hopefully, a home environment that works for them. So the lovely Jana talked a bit about our numbers, but it was fun to look at where folks are coming from and to see who's currently housed with us. So a large majority of our people are coming from homelessness and from chronic homelessness. 37% from living rough, and then a few coming straight from the prison system. These are some of the things I'm proud of the work we do. So one of the exciting things as we've grown to own more houses is that we're able to rehouse people when their first placement was not an appropriate space, or it has become an inappropriate space depending on how people's lives and lifestyles change. For those of you doing this work, you also probably know that spaces like long-term care aren't always accessible to people who are experiencing substance use or mental health struggles, and so we've had to learn lots about doing palliative care, and it's felt lovely to be able to support people dying with dignity housed instead of outside. Most of the people living with us have been there for over a year. Our longest residents have been there for about 8 years. We have lost people back into homelessness, so 4 of our existing residents did move back into homelessness. Congregate living is hard, and that's one of the things we've learned is that if I was struggling with my mental health, if I was living alone, then that's a mental health issue. But because I'm living with other people, it is now also possibly a safety issue or lifestyle issue with other people in the house. If you're interested in buying housing, this is how we do it. And I just wanted to share a few details about it so that maybe it becomes a bit more tangible and less overwhelming. So the first thing we do is we find a house. Often, like I mentioned, people are coming to us and saying, hey, do you want to buy this from me? And that is super. So we often look at how many rooms. We found that 7 bedrooms is really too big. And so we stick to 4-bedroom houses now. Is the location a place that makes sense? Are there bus routes? Are there clinics close by? And then what is the cost? Then we need to determine supports, because that helps us figure out how much funding is required. So are they one city supports that we need to find money for, or are we partnering with No-Go or eFry or Forecast, and they're going to be in charge of those supports? And then using all that information, we figure out the monthly cost versus rental income. So that will help us figure out how much we can pay and what down payment we need so that it lowers the cost every month so that rents can stay as affordable as possible. And then you got to do fundraising, which thankfully we've been really lucky. We have found that people get excited about giving money towards capital. They can see the house and they feel like it's a tangible long-term place for them to donate money to. And so we've been really lucky. This is our most recent purchase. Our goal is to purchase 1 house a year. And so we had a house we had been doing agent of the landlord work for when Tent City emerged in 2019. A woman who lived in town said, I would like to buy a house for you to house folks coming out of Tent City from. And so we did that. And last year she decided she needed to sell that house and sold it to us, or offered to sell it to us at below market. So we had the house, we had the people who were already living there, we wanted to keep them there, and One City had already been providing supports. So those pieces were there. We have a lovely housing director who knows how to do math about what's involved in housing, and we figured out that because of the amount of cost there was involved and the maximum amount of rent that we were willing to charge people, we needed a 50% down payment for that house. So that meant $225,000. And in this occasion, we sent out 5 letters requesting money, and one of them said, I will cover it. So we've been very lucky in engaging people in the community who have the resources and are prioritizing using their money for this kind of thing. And so each house that we have purchased has its own story around what that's looked like, but it has been doable. One of the things I want to note is that there is housing supports involved, which is so important. We need that team to be really creative. I mean, we have Jana working with us, so you can see the heart that is part of that kind of work. There are also lots of other teams that we work with that have made this work feel more doable. So we have a great maintenance team that deals with all the bugs. We have a great agent of the landlord team that knows about the policies and legalities around housing purchase and rentals. And we also have a board that is on board with us being bold around purchasing housing and using it in this way. So if you are on boards or in any of these other places, that's something that you can do. Some of the gaps that we find, so supports are hard to fund. Supports are less sexy than buying housing. And so while we have never had an issue fundraising to buy the actual housing, we do have to work hard to fund our supports. We currently don't take government money, so we use private donations and one-time grants to fund our housing support, and part of that has been because we want to make sure that we can match people really well in each of those houses. And so our next step is to figure out how can we be part of the by name list and the coordinated access system in a way that allows us more access to funds, because supports are crucial in doing good housing work, also in a way that honors the wants and needs of residents. We don't have 24/7 low barrier housing, and we see that need on an ongoing basis. People in our housing who've been stable for a really long time are now aging, and this is a whole new thing that we're seeing, a whole new challenge. But the intersection of mental health and substance use and physical health and the trauma of having been homeless is very real, and 24/7 low barrier housing. Let's make it happen. For some people, independent living is a must. So there's some people we've tried to house in congregate living, and it does not work. People need more space. And like I mentioned, if you're struggling with mental health, for example, or you moved into a house where substances were allowed and now you want to use less substances, it's hard to make those lifestyle changes when you're living in a shared space. And we are still, as a nonprofit, holding the power in this situation. So I like to think that we are kind and benevolent and have good intentions, and I still hold a ton of power over the people that we're housing, and I am not challenging that right now. So we are protecting housing from the private market, and I'd love us to think about how we continue to give power to the people who are living in those houses. Is that it? Oh. Next steps. We're going to keep buying up housing, and we would love to continue having conversations with other nonprofits who are interested in either providing the supports with our help managing or who are interested in buying housing themselves. We are finalizing right now a report on congregate supportive living experiences. So we've been meeting with residents who live in our housing and also in other housing in the city, to learn about how to do this well. Often most of our systems or the ways we've learned to provide support assume that people live on their own, and there's lots of ways where doing the community aspects of the housing, we do shared meals, we do so much mediation work. All of those pieces are really important in housing stability. And then exploring how municipalities, provinces, and nonprofits can partner to purchase housing. So there's so many skills in that, right? Governments have more access to leveraging resources. Nonprofits can often be more nimble. And so working together, I think, is really the way. This is the thing we saw recently on Remax Luxury. But if you know the Knox apartments, they are affordable, market pegged. Is that right? units that have currently gone back up for sale. And so, this is what gets me thinking about what is some of that work that we can do to work together to keep housing that has been historically affordable in the nonprofit sector and not back in Remax luxury listings. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, but that was awesome. And so, speak up. Yeah, in the very far back, and shout or be very projective.
Thank you for this. I go back far enough to be able to make these comments, I guess. People don't know. It's a wonderful presentation of numbers and amounts and philosophy. But a lot of people don't know that the history of number of housing units that we have that you've described goes back a long way, and it involves an enormous amount of community. That people came together privately in homes and talked to each other, and they set about doing this. You mentioned, and I say congratulations to everything that you just gave here. Peterborough should be extraordinarily proud of the community housing work we've done and the stock that we have and are preserving. The person who came forward with the money for that house is an example of community at work. It might have been an individual homeowner. Well, one of the organizations you mentioned was Kairos Nonprofit Housing. And that started off with a couple of people coming together in their homes and saying, what can we do to house women leaving shelters? And they mortgaged their own homes to provide the early money to purchase homes, and they got someone to duplex these homes, and these homes are still operating under the nonprofit housing, social housing portfolio. And I think in that vein of communities coming together, we should mention a group that has not been mentioned today, and that is Peterborough Action for Tiny Homes, PATH. That's a struggling and worthy group who are really working hard, again, as a group arising out of the community, ordinary people coming together. So that's just a little bit of history from someone who's been around for a while. Thank you so much.
I was just looking at that last slide you showed, Tammy, and the price of that, and I was looking at the price of the unit, which I think is $100,000 per unit, $4 million for 42 units. And I'm thinking about the number you shared, Rebecca, which is it costs $450,000 to build an affordable unit. And I wonder what opportunities you see for the city acquiring housing, because there's so much more money, access to so much more money than one city.
Mm-hmm. Acquisition is definitely one of our tools, and it's funny that the Knox came up because, of course, the Knox was funded, and we do still have some units there that are offering even lower, like 60% of average market rent, which actually comes close to RGI. The trick is the funding. So we don't have enough to buy the Knox. But when these opportunities come up, we think really hard about them and we try to figure out how to make it happen, because we recognize that it's just as important to keep units out of the market as it is to create new ones, because if we're just building over here and we're losing, we're still in a net loss position. So acquisition is definitely part of what we're looking at. I meant to mention too, through the Municipal Services Corporation, that we've set up to basically shield the city from debt so that we can do things like that. Because as it stands currently, I'm just going to stand up. As it stands currently, if the city wanted to buy something, or if Peterborough Housing wanted to buy something, it goes onto the debt capacity, and that debt capacity is what allows us to fix roads and bridges and do all kinds of different things. And so if we're taking up too much of that debt capacity in housing, we get hindered on the other side. I won't say anything. Priorities, everyone has their priorities at City Hall, and the infrastructure people obviously have their priorities in infrastructure. So, but the Municipal Services Corporation will basically allow us, it's like they don't need a cosigner on the loan anymore. So they can go ahead and borrow. And the $19 million that we're getting for Monaghan is like an asset that we now have free and clear that we can borrow. And we're definitely looking at acquisition as one of the opportunities going forward for sure.
So that is officially us out. Does anyone have a burning thing they need to say before we go for lunch? Yes.
I just want to say that the police budget was raised by, requested to be raised by $4 million this past year, and that's exactly what the cost of this unit was. So I just wanted to make that.
That is excellent food for thought as we go into lunch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Research for Social Change Lab podcast. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to follow us on Apple Music, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on the Research for Social Change Lab's activities, including past, present, and future projects, visit socialchangelab.ca.